and welcome to our next episode. My name's Sally Powell. I'm a family law partner here at Tees, and I'm joined by the lovely Clare Pilsworth, who is also a partner in family law. And we're here today to talk a little bit more about what we deal with in terms of family finances when we have clients approach us about divorce. So when we meet with our clients for the first time, we talk through the process of the divorce, which we've covered in a different podcast.
Yes.
But there's two key areas that people are always interested in: what's happening with their children and what's happening with their finances. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we start thinking about how to approach the financial aspects of couples who are separating, married couples who are separating in particular.
Yes.
So how does that thought process start for you when you're talking to new clients?
Well, it's one of the things that they're most scared about. So I know that you quite frequently say, well, actually, I want to get a client's own front door for them. So what we need to think about in order to help them with that is, firstly, how much is there in terms of assets? Where is it? So clients might sometimes think, well, they're just asking me a lot of questions and they're not yet advising me, because actually we do have to have some detail around it. So have they got a property? How much is it worth? Have they got pensions? Have they got what we commonly call liquid cash, and we assume everybody else knows? We basically mean assets that we can convert quite easily into cash to deal with housing and those sorts of things. So it's a big sort of discussion to really understand a client and their finances. And it's probably really helpful to explain that a lot of people go, I don't know all of that. I've literally just come to see you. You're asking me a load of questions and I don't know. And we'll maybe talk in a minute about the fact that there's a really good way of finding out all of those financial questions. But to start with, it's really for us to have to understand how much there is before we can get to then saying what we're going to do, what can we do for you, and how can we make it happen. And so I also say something which I'm going to mention now, which is I like to call it early. And by that, I mean, clients want to know. They're worried. They're really worried about what's going to happen about finances. So they want to know sooner rather than later. So we do aim in our discussions to give them a clear idea as soon as possible. So what we'll talk about over the next few minutes is some of the sort of commonly thought questions that really worry people, to understand, how does the law deal with finances? How does it work out who gets what and how we divide? All of those things. So yes, the start point is, what is there that we can work with, and how can we then move on to what are we going to do?
So to simplify it, really it's two questions that we've got to answer.
It is.
What have we got and how do we share it?
Yes.
In some respects.
What the principles are around sharing it.
Yeah, exactly that. And when you put it like that, it sounds like it should be really easy. But we know, actually, devil's always in the detail. And also, it does take some experience to be able to recognise what we're dealing with, because we may have complex asset structures, we may have businesses, we may have more than one property, and complex income streams. So from our perspective, a bit of experience can go quite a long way in being able to do as you say, which is call it early. Because the shape of how a settlement might look at the end of the day, if we can get to that point as early as possible, we're really helping people move forward in a timely fashion. So, that's a good way of summarising, I think. If we break it down to the two simple things that we've got to do, then we can get a little bit more complicated. And people are worried, aren't they?
Yes, so people might often say, can I stay in my house? Because where people live is a real worry, isn't it? Some people don't know necessarily how much the mortgage is or how it's being paid and those kind of things. So it's all that kind of stuff. And it's a bit annoying sometimes when we have to say it depends. It feels like a real lawyer's answer, doesn't it? It depends. So we need to try and look at those things as soon as we have information to do that.
And the context usually gives the answer on whether or not actually that would be a viable answer in the circumstances of any individual case. And I think that's kind of why I enjoy what I do, is that every marriage is different, so every financial plan that you can construct when people are splitting up to get them into the next chapter is always slightly different, which is the rewarding part from my perspective. Navigating that is part of the challenge, isn't it?
Yes, and you talked about complex structures.
Yeah.
Life now, in terms of finances, there's so many different ways you can invest, or you can move money around, or the really unusual and new ways in which people will actually take income isn't necessarily I get it paid into my bank each month. It's in shares, or it's in options, and all sorts of things. And so how we do it is always very different for each set of circumstances we've got. But there are some standard sort of principles we're going to need to think about to help us with that.
Yeah.
And before we get to that, it's probably helpful to talk about, well, what do we do if someone says, well, I don't know what there is. I've never been the one that's dealt with the finances. It's probably helpful to talk about a really particular way in which we will get what we call disclosure, i.e. everybody has to be transparent and share the information that they have about finances. So there can't be secrets in that respect.
Yeah.
There's a very clear path in which that information needs to be shared.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And often the way to get the information is simply that you have to ask for it so that it can be explained to us as the lawyer, and from us to our clients, to make sure everybody understands what we're dealing with. Most people would share information because they can see the benefits of making sure everybody's up to speed and on the same page, and then we're all talking about the same thing. It can be the case where that isn't dealt with as speedily as we might want, and there may be occasions where people just don't want to share information, and there are things that we can do to make sure that information is shared so that we are all on the same page should we need to do that. But most people, on a voluntary basis would say, yeah, of course we've got to share this information so that we can distill that information into one side of A4 and say, here's an asset schedule of what we're dealing with. We're relatively comfortable that's reliable, and we can then base our advice on the same principles for the structure of an outcome. Yeah.
So if a client came to you and said, well, I paid for everything, so it's not fair that I have to share half of it, what would you say to them?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because the concept that it's alluding to is an underlying sense of what an individual might feel is appropriate or fair, which is a bit of a four-letter word to family lawyers. One person's fair is the next person's not fair. But there are various principles that are set out in legislation which sets out the factors that we have to have regard to when we're basing our advice to people. And if I've got somebody who says, well, I've paid for everything and we've got a marriage of some years, and it may be right that there is a balance drawn. Equally, non-financial contributions are treated in the same way. And so often place, if it's, well, I earned this during the marriage, there's normally a balance in the marriage somewhere to say, well, actually, whilst you were doing that, I was doing this to support the marriage as well. And that would be treated the same.
So using the example, a sort of quite common example would be the decision has been made during the marriage that one person's going to continue to go out of the home to do work, and that happens to be paid work, whereas one person's going to stay at home and help raise the children and keep the family running and all those kind of things, and that work happens to not be paid, and that's quite a common thing that will have arisen when you particularly got a long marriage. There's so much to get through in the week, you're balancing those jobs. And so it's helpful for people to know that actually that won't be taken into account. It's actually looking at what there is and what people need potentially, or whether there's sufficient funds and actually there's enough we're sharing across the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing that I like to try and bear in mind, and I do say to people, and I'm sure, well, you tell me if you think about it in the same way, but there's not just one right answer. There's lots of different right answers. And you may be happy with a range of certain right answers, which is why family lawyers have do the work that they do at all. Otherwise, it would be very formulaic, and the government and the justice system doesn't want that to be overtly formulaic, because it doesn't allow for discretion of taking into account the balances that the family courts have. And I actually think that's quite a healthy thing, because everybody's situation is different. So there's lots of different things that we take into account. People might want to have a little bit more certainty and precision on, well, what is the right answer? And I think that can get a little infuriating when you're not living and breathing family law as we do, when we know that there's lots of nuance and lots of areas where there's got to be some give and take, and we can't be overly prescriptive.
Well, the way I like to look at it is actually people can be really involved in reaching their decision. So there isn't one right answer. It isn't that we do X, Y, and Z, and then there we are, magic, here's your answer. We're actually saying, look, within a range, all of these feel right as options. Which one do you feel is more right for you? So that actually people have an element of being involved. Sometimes it won't be as straightforward as that, but you'll tend to be within a parameter. So if someone might say, let's use this as an example, I prefer to have more money to buy a bigger house and less pension, for example. So actually that's quite a useful thought around. Some people might say, well, my ex has a bigger pension, can I have a share of that? That's an asset, but people often don't necessarily think about it so readily, because they're thinking they're focused on the house, and it's our job to say, well, actually all of these things are the assets with value that need to be taken into account. So that's an often used example around, well, how will people make those decisions? And it depends what they want to do with the assets. So there are some elements of looking at it through some options.
Yeah. I guess there's individual priorities as well.
Yes.
So at the stage of life that you might be at, pensions may feel less relevant to your world, and you've got working life ahead of you. Is it something that is of the same value as having your own front door, the phrase we've used? And often it's a balance, and it's about the individual. And as you say, I think having an element of control over your own preferences can shape the structure of a settlement as well.
So we've talked a lot about assets.
Yeah.
One of the things that we quite commonly find is that people will say, well, my parents gave me some money to buy the house or to do something with. Gave often is an interesting word at that point, isn't it? Because that parent, or we might then find someone is saying, well, my parents want it back now. Yeah. And we're trying to understand, was it a gift? Was it a loan? And so on. Yeah. And what would you say to clients in those circumstances?
Well, I mean, often it's a difficult one, isn't it? In that you do need to understand the background, why it happened, what were the circumstances, the phraseology at the time that this happened, what's happened since, and has it only been triggered by the breakdown of a relationship that actually maybe we weren't as happy about this as we had been previously. We talk a little bit about, in family law context, of unmatched contributions. So it may still be relevant that something has come in extra and above from one side, that there can be some consideration for the balancing act of, well, what do we do with our overall resources? We're back to the lawyer's answer, aren't we? It kind of it depends. It depends on all the circumstances of the case, what's needed, what the resources are. And we've got to take it from there. So I think if somebody had that situation, I'd want to get into the detail of how it happened, when it happened, why it happened, and what the ripple out effect of that would be if we pursue the point of it being of major significance. So
I think that's right, isn't it? There's often talk around, well, you know, the parents won't ask for it back in the same way that a bank will.
Yeah.
But we are finding that as a bigger question now with parents thinking about tax planning for inheritance tax and those kind of things. And you mentioned in previous podcasts we've done, well, we might say, well, actually, you know, you need to think about prenuptial agreements and those kind of things.
Do you also find one of the frequent questions we get right at the beginning is, what happens if I move out?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, of the family home before you've dealt with advising me about finances and those kind of things. Yeah. And that does come up quite regularly. And it actually is really important to think about, well, actually, it doesn't impact the advice that we give about how things are divided. But in the shorter term, it may have more bearing on whether someone is actually sort of communicating well with the other person to try and really keep discussion to reach a solution sooner rather than later. Sometimes it keeps everybody more focused if they're in the same property, but that's really easy for us to say and not so easy to do if you're living in a house and you've decided you want to separate. It can be very difficult to keep that going if you don't want to. So people can move out while we're sorting everything.
You don't lose any legal rights.
You don't lose any legal rights. But obviously we need a more short-term thought around, can that be afforded?
Yeah. And I think there's some practical issues arising as well, because whilst you don't lose legal rights, actually to then come and go from a jointly owned property can cause problems if it's not done in a respectful way.
And if you have children and that's going to be a sort of temporary place while we're sorting out finances. So if that comes up, I think it's a thing that's more sensible to talk to solicitors about and say, actually, I'm thinking about this, just really understanding the pros and cons of doing it so that you know if you're doing it, it feels right for you as a client.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah. So we've focused a lot on assets.
Yeah.
Obviously, the other area is income.
Yeah.
Income, how people are going to pay bills, how are they going to cover housing costs and all of those sorts of things. And so actually, what do we normally say around a question we get asked quite regularly is, will I have to pay my ex maintenance or can I get paid maintenance from my ex? And so I'm going to say over to you before I say it's another lawyer's answer of it.
Depends. Well, yeah, I think understanding how the marriage finances worked in terms of income is normally where I would start. How are bills paid at the moment? Is there a joint account? How is it fed? Does your salary go in? Do you have two salaries in the household? Does it both go into a joint account? How does it work, basically? And usually I would start from the point of view of, well, let's just maintain the status quo for now. We are challenged with trying to make two households out of one. How will that work? Is it through splitting capital resources and income resources in such a way that it works? Is there a balance that can be drawn to say, well, more capital will help here and less income would be better, because then there doesn't have to be a maintenance arrangement other than perhaps for children, but for the husband or wife, so spouse. So we would say spousal maintenance, which seems quite old school language. But
it does, doesn't it?
That's what gets bandied around, doesn't it? Spousal maintenance. Often I would start, because this is basically where the courts start, isn't it? Which is, can we achieve what we would term a clean break, which is that the claims that arise as a consequence of being married for income and capital are resolved once and for all. There's nothing lingering on. There's no ongoing maintenance claim. It's done in one go. So that would be the clean break. And I think generally the courts would consider in the first instance, and therefore family lawyers have to do that in the first meeting as well. Can that be achieved? Because it is presumed to be better for people, that they can separate from each other and extract their lives to be able to move on. That's not always possible. Sometimes maintenance is relevant and is needed. And then there's the question of, well, how much and for how long, which is almost impossible to answer at the beginning. But it's something that is going to be relevant and something that needs to be investigated, because it's a practical consideration for making these two households that are going to be needed for the future.
And it's really important to say that actually that part of our discussion is, we've talked about the odd phrase spousal maintenance, but child maintenance is entirely separate as that, and we'll talk about that when we do our podcast in relation to child arrangements. But we've got spousal maintenance that can often lead to conversations around, well, their income isn't as straightforward as a salary coming in. So we do regularly see different pay structures now, not just people with self-employed where their income is less certain, but there are more creative ways in which companies now pay and so on. So we're used to seeing all of those, aren't we? And having to come up with creative ways of it's sort of income, but actually it's shares and it doesn't come in the bank, so isn't helping from a cash flow bills perspective, but is all still irrelevant when we're looking at what income is.
And that's why it's important to have the clarity of information in the first place, isn't it? So that you know what we're dealing with. Yeah,
definitely.
So we have our set guidance. I've mentioned the Matrimonial Causes Act earlier on. And we have these various factors when we're talking about these claims that arise for income and for capital. And I tend to run through the factors when I'm talking to clients, and what would, in the context of their own situation, would be the priority. And I would usually say, we've talked about, well, finding out what the resources are. So resources is one of those factors, isn't it?
Yes.
And resources might be mortgage capacity or other items rather than just what's in the bank. We've talked a little bit about contributions in the context of, well, I did this work. Well, there's a flip side of being at home doing non-paid work. And we've talked a little bit about what people need, which tend to be the three main areas that we focus on in the context of our first meetings with people. But there are other factors to bear in mind, and they're all weighted with each other, I think. But it's the experience that leads you to, these are the key areas that we want to get to so that we can see the wood for the trees in terms of what the outcome might be. We've also, I guess, touched upon the main principles of how family lawyers will approach things, the sharing and the needs, and how that can balance out. I mean, how do you normally weave that into your discussions with clients?
It's a bit of science and a bit of an art kind of thing, isn't it, really? Because we make decisions in our head as we're going along that, and understanding individual clients, that certain bits already won't apply. But sometimes we might then need to revisit that dependent what happens with further information. But generally speaking, I feel that clients should understand why I'm coming to a point of advice. So I will talk through bits of factors around housing, resources, what we can do, needs, sharing, those kind of things. But I feel like sometimes it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a big piece of what we go Section 25 factors from the Matrimonial Causes Act, as if, of course, everybody knows what they are. And that's part of that, really feeling like you're a team with your client, and the client needs to feel that they can trust us to go, these are the relevant bits. I won't bombard you with all of this legislation and what judges may say with discretion on this element and that element, and to say these feel like the main bits for you. But at the same time, take time with the clients to understand what it is their main. What finances tends to be driven by worry and fear, doesn't it? They don't know what's going on, and to make them feel that they can actually discuss all of what that is that worries them, so I can make sure I am picking out the right bits. of that, because otherwise the principles sound quite sort of unwieldy to people who aren't used to them. And in essence, we provided we've got all of the resources there, their needs are going to be met in terms of housing and income. But we will have to sometimes talk about earning capacity, a thing that is it just particularly if you're a person who's not been in paid employment for a while, we do need to explore those to make sure we're not missing anything when we're getting to the right advice for them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I suppose the benefit of where we are is that we also have the wealth team who can help us with future planning. If there are worries about retirement and how to juggle the resources that have to last a long time.
And understanding pensions. Pensions, actually, a lot of people just pay into pensions, but they don't really think about what it's going to pay out to them because it feels like a thing that happens way in the future. So if you've got someone who's got a pension that's tied with their salary, say, it's not always entirely clear what people think that they're going to achieve from that. So the wealth team can help us with all of those.
It's really specialist, isn't it?
Yes.
So sometimes we might be approached as, well, it should be really simple because this is X, Y, Z. And actually, when you start getting into what do you want to achieve and why and how is that going to work, and then you've got to look at the other side of the coin, which is, well, this will work for me, but it's got to work to a certain extent for your X to be. You know, that it's got to be in balance. And that's I guess that's where is the science and the art point that you made, which I think is really good. It's how does that fit together? And for another day, but there's lots of different processes that we can help people with to find their own answers with a bit of support along the way. And if they can't find their own answers, there's lots of support we can provide about, well, this is the direction of travel then. This is how we get an outcome. Because there has to be an outcome. Life has got to move on. And the idea is, with the call it early principle, is that we try and navigate that as quickly as we can.
Thank you for joining us. If you do have more questions, because we've done a whistle-stop tour of all of the financial points today, do get in touch. We'll be able to help you at Tees with that. And we look forward to seeing you next time.